Welcome to Science Sunday. Here we are. I think this is our 11th year of doing Science Sunday. We started in the 2012, I believe, so about 10 years ago we were in the other section of the building starting to talk about science, and we've kept going, so I think that's a kind of a neat accomplishment, and thanks for all of you that supported and come along and been with us for that. Welcome. It's helpful, we think, in any mental endeavor like what we're going to do today to state one's premises up front. We believe there's no such thing as a bad question in this room. We draw a distinction between this premise and the fact that the number of bad answers is actually uncountable. We also recognize that science in all its forms, biological, astronomical, geological, psychological, economical, and social, is the only viable means of separating good, accurate, and truthful answers from fantastical, mythological, or just uninformed ones. So that's some of the basic premise that Science Sunday has started with and has continued. We've been here at the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church. We're grateful and continue to be grateful to the church really for providing us a place to meet on the first and third Sundays of the regular church season. We invite you here to come in, and thanks so much for the people who have come here today, and you at home to explore science with us and share any knowledge you may have about nature and the cosmos. We also invite you to explore this community of science lovers, many of whom are members of this church. We hope you'll find that we're welcoming and warm and generally worth knowing. We suspect you are too. So thanks so much for coming. We appreciate the physical sanctuary, the physical space that we have here, and the emotional and psychological space that's given to us by the church. Interesting topic for today. I just wanted to do a few talks about plans for the year. You may notice that my sidekick, Scott Thompson, isn't here today. He's recovering. He's under the weather a little bit. He thought it was safer for him not to come in and stay, but I believe he's listening at home and may have some comments coming in later. I hope that maybe you had a chance to see Steve Cooper and Becky Trombley-Freitag's latest Science and Humanism talk. I wanted to bring it up with you. If you haven't seen it, it was a regular service in early August. They read from the third Humanist Manifesto and then had displays and experiments and ideas, scientific ideas and mathematical ideas that illuminated them and explored them a little bit too. So I would think a lot of you here may be interested in seeing that if you haven't seen it already. I know Scott, I was going to talk with him a little bit. He traveled to Alaska this summer. I went to see my daughter in Seattle. You notice we didn't have Science Sunday through the summer. We were taking a bit of a break. My daughter in Seattle and her new baby. And also I was in Virginia countryside for my son's wedding. So I had a pretty busy family-filled summer, and I hope you had a nice summer as well too. My shop out in St. Charles has been incredibly busy, but I did get a lot of time for reading. I did some reading, quite a bit about opioids and so on, and some other topics that I think will be coming up later in the year. And I also got a chance to do some pretty good amount of biking too. It's so nice to have some people in here present. We've had small numbers at times as we've opened it up, and I think Scott and I were both kind of feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the need of always coming in and presenting to a camera. And we knew that you were at home, many of you listening and so on, but part of the real enjoyment of this is the interaction, and we had a fun time just talking with the people that are here before we started, and it means so much. So thanks so much for the people that are here, and if you have a chance and you're at home and can come to further ones, it means a lot. I think Scott and I felt like maybe the currency that pays for our efforts to put these things together is really your involvement and your interest and your participation in this small community. So it means a lot to me to have you folks here, so thanks so much. I wanted to get talking about opioids today. I heard a couple of webcasts about it, and there's some things I'll probably get to parenthetically about it. I don't really want to go into maybe all the political things about it and how deeply different families and different people in opioids. I wanted to keep it more on the scientific aspect of it, but I don't think I can stray away from all of it too long. It's probably an interesting topic to me because you can't just say it's a terrible thing, you know, the opioids. They've been very important and very helpful, very beneficial to many people in the last while. They've actually have a pretty long history about it too. So I have a short video that we're hoping doesn't cause any problems, and I wanted to start out with that to just give a kind of an introduction to opioids and see what people think about, or if there's any important information about it from there. So this is about 8 minutes long, and we'll see how it goes.
More than 3,000 years ago, a flower began to appear in remedies in ancient Egyptian medical texts. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Minoans likely found ways to use the same plant for its high. Both ancient civilizations were onto something. Opium, an extract of the poppy in question, can both induce pleasure and reduce pain. Though opium has remained in use ever since, it wasn't until the 19th century that one of its chemical compounds, morphine, was identified and isolated for medical use. Morphine, codeine, and other substances made directly from the poppy are called opiates. In the 20th century, drug companies created a slew of synthetic substances similar to these opiates, including heroin, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and fentanyl. Whether synthetic or derived from opium, these compounds are collectively known as opioids. Synthetic or natural, legal or illicit, opioid drugs are very effective painkillers, but they are also highly addictive. In the 1980s and 90s, pharmaceutical companies began to market opioid painkillers aggressively, actively downplaying their addictive potential to both the medical community and the public. The number of opioid painkillers prescriptions skyrocketed, and so did cases of opioid addiction, beginning a crisis that continues today. To understand why opioids are so addictive, it helps to trace how these drugs affect the human body, from the first dose through repeated use to what happens when long-term use stops. Each of these drugs has slightly different chemistry, but all act on the body's opioid system by binding to opioid receptors in the brain. The body's endorphins temper pain signals by binding to these receptors, and opioid drugs bind much more strongly for longer. So opioid drugs can manage much more severe pain than endorphins can. Opioid receptors also influence everything from mood to normal bodily functions. With these functions too, opioids' binding strength and durability mean their effects are more pronounced and widespread than those of the body's natural signaling molecules. When a drug binds to opioid receptors, it triggers the release of dopamine, which is linked to feelings of pleasure and may be responsible for the sense of euphoria that characterizes an opioid high. At the same time, opioids suppress the release of noradrenaline, which influences wakefulness, breathing, digestion, and blood pressure. A therapeutic dose decreases noradrenaline enough to cause side effects like constipation. At higher doses, opioids can decrease heart and breathing rates to dangerous levels, causing loss of consciousness and even death. Over time, the body starts to develop a tolerance for opioids. It may decrease its number of opioid receptors, or the receptors may become less responsive. To experience the same release of dopamine and resulting mood effects as before, people have to take larger and larger doses. A cycle that leads to physical dependence and addiction. As people take more opioids to compensate for tolerance, noradrenaline levels become lower and lower, to a point that could impact basic bodily functions. The body compensates by increasing its number of noradrenaline receptors so it can detect much smaller amounts of noradrenaline. This increased sensitivity to noradrenaline allows the body to continue functioning normally. In fact, it becomes dependent on opioids to maintain the new balance. When someone who is physically dependent on opioids stops taking them abruptly, that balance is disrupted. Noradrenaline levels can increase within a day of ceasing opioid use, but the body takes much longer to get rid of all the extra noradrenaline receptors it made. That means there's a period of time when the body is too sensitive to noradrenaline. This oversensitivity causes withdrawal symptoms, including muscle aches, stomach pains, fever, and vomiting. Though temporary, opioid withdrawal can be incredibly debilitating. In serious cases, someone in withdrawal can be violently ill for days or even weeks. People who are addicted to opioids aren't necessarily using the drugs to get high anymore, but rather to avoid being sick. Many risk losing wages or even jobs while in withdrawal, or may not have anyone to take care of them during withdrawal. If someone goes back to using opioids later, they can be at particularly high risk for overdose, because what would have been a standard dose while their tolerance was high can now be lethal. Since 1980, accidental deaths from opioid overdose have grown exponentially in the United States, and opioid addictions have also exploded around the world. While opioid painkiller prescriptions are becoming more closely regulated, cases of overdose and addiction are still increasing, especially among younger people. Many of the early cases of addiction were middle-aged people who became addicted to painkillers they had been prescribed, or received from friends and family members with prescriptions. Today, young people are often introduced to prescription opioid drugs in those ways, but move on to heroin or illicit synthetic opioids that are cheaper and easier to come by. Beyond tighter regulation of opioid painkillers, what can we do to reverse the growing rates of
Okay. I didn't realize that we got a warning, so I think they stopped that video at that point. So we'll have to be more careful what kind of videos I bring in to show there. But I thought that was helpful in showing the aspects of how opioids can be impacted in people's lives, the effort it takes, what it does actually physically inside you. These receptors can become adapted to the amount of opioids that are being taken, and that's called gaining tolerance, obviously. Any thoughts or questions? Anybody have any points about that? Okay.
What's the order of strength of those? I mean, you have all these listed. You don't hear about fentanyl being like super sensitive, but is this the order of their sensitivity?
OxyContin, I've heard some things saying that it's 50 to 100 times more powerful than straight opiates, morphines and codeines and so on. And fentanyl can be 100 times more powerful than OxyContin as well, too. Yes? Okay. 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 All right. Looks like they took us offline, so we'll talk just here as a group. Oh, really? Okay. All right, I'll have to learn more about what's effective, what's allowable on online and what's not. So OxyContin was FDA approved in 1995, and it was part of a very, very aggressive effort by a company called Purdue Pharmaceuticals and the Sackler family. I don't know how many here have heard of them. Yeah. And they had, they kind of were famous or proud of the fact that they were one of the most beneficent donors to museums and things like that. They made a